What do you call a cow who's just given birth?
I don't know.
Decalcinated.
Oh, geez, Louise. That was terrible.
No, it's good.
It was terrible.
It's good.
Hungry Squared, bringing you the best food talk anywhere.
Welcome to the Hungry Square podcast for the brain and belly meat. I'm Sharon from the Wasatch Cooking Guide.
And I'm Winter from theredparty.com. This week, we are talking about something I know nothing about.
Coffee.
Yeah, I know nothing.
Which is why that's a good joke.
It is. That's true. We have a special guest on, Chris Deferio, and we are so excited. He is the host of Keys to the Shop, a podcast as well that talks about specifically about coffee and coffee cafe owners and that type of thing. And he let us in on all the good coffee information. It was really awesome.
He's a specialty coffee insider, and it was fascinating to listen to him.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Hey, Sharon, what's up?
Hi, how's your week?
That was a
Winter?
terrible joke.
No, it was good. Decaffeinated.
Terrible joke.
Awesome. You're just mad you didn't think of it.
That's totally it.
I didn't think of it either, but it's a good joke.
So how was your week?
Good.
What'd you eat this week?
I ate a lot of things. I've been out to eat quite a bit this week because I was traveling for work.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
But one of the things that I did eat this week was at home. Every once in a while, probably like once a month, we do breakfast for dinner.
Classic.
Yep.
Easy.
Yep. And fast. So it's yummy and we like it and it's fast. So of course it's a go-to. But I had really amazing bacon.
What kind?
It's from Winco.
Really?
Yes. And I know a lot of people, frown on Winco.
No. It's so if anybody doesn't know what Winco is, it's a very budget friendly type of a supermarket.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Mm-hmm. It's a Western supermarket chain. It's in, I think, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Utah. Anyway, they're very budget friendly. You can buy in bulk. They have lots of sales and things like that.
It's not very frilly.
No.
Not at all.
You have to bag your own groceries here because we're saving money.
Yep.
However, I got some really good bacon there, and it was just kind of Winco packaged bacon, but it's really thick.
Like a thick cut bacon?
Super thick cut. Thicker than when I go to maybe like some of the nicer grocery stores where their butchers do it and stuff like that. This is still thicker.
That is thick cut bacon.
It cooks up super crispy and still stays thick. Some of the thick cuts that you buy, like it looks really good in the package, but when it actually cooks up, it shrinks.
Yeah,
and
fat renders and it's
and it
tiny.
Gets really thin, but this stays thick and it was super good.
Nice.
It was a hickory smoked.
Okay, that was the other thing I was going to ask. What was the smoking, the cured flavor, I guess.
It was yummy.
Okay, well, Winco bacon, everybody. If you haven't tried, I have not tried it.
Yeah, so it's like $7 a package. It's like $6.99. So for Winco, that's a little bit pricey.
It is.
However, you guys,
it's worth it.
It's totally worth it. It's worth every penny. And something this nice, like you could get it at a butcher shop, but you would pay at least double for it, if not more.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Who knew? Winco bacon.
Yep. What did you eat this week, Winter?
So one of my coworkers actually brought in a treat, and I haven't had this particular treat forever. I had Buckeyes. Do you know what Buckeyes are?
Oh, yeah. It's like, they're a cookie.
Kind of.
It's kind of like I think you classify it as a cookie.
Yeah. In a sense, it's basically like peanut butter, powdered sugar, like that combination, and then dipped in chocolate, right? There's variations to making this. She made it, I'm not quite exactly sure what it was. So I have had Buckeyes that are smoother. So it's just like a peanut butter, powdered sugar combination, and then rolled into balls and then dipped into chocolate. Really good. It's basically a peanut butter cup, right? That's all it is. But hers had some sort of cereal in it.
Oh.
like crushed up cornflakes or something like that.
There was some crunch.
There was a little bit of crunch, and I kind of like that.
Nice.
And I'm going to have to get her recipe from her, and I'll post it on the show notes. But there's a couple of other ones that I found. So I'll post a traditional one, like the Smitten Kitchen has a good little, lovely little Buckeye one recipe, which I think has cream cheese in it too. Like, let's just up the...
They're pretty rich.
They are very rich. They're lovely. And then, but if you want one with a little bit of texture...
Yes.
Right?
I think I would like one with texture.
I think it was either... I want to say it was like a cornflake or maybe a rice cereal.
Okay.
That could have been in there. Actually, I'm going to say it's a rice cereal because her husband is gluten. He has celiac, so he needs gluten-free.
Well, you can find gluten-free cornflakes too.
That's true. I'll have to ask her what she used, but I will, when I get that, I'll post it on those show notes. But it's a fun little treat, and it's kind of easy to make. And who doesn't like peanut butter and chocolate? Yeah. Okay, I know there's some people that can't do that, but I love it.
And now for the main course.
Okay, let's get down to our topic at hand, and that is our coffee interview with Chris Deferio.
Oh my gosh, you guys, I don't know anything about coffee, but that was really very interesting.
I know a lot more about coffee now.
Yeah.
I knew just some very basics from trial and error, but this, I'm excited to put some of his suggestions to use.
So a couple of things to be aware of. I'm going to post in the show notes, if you are a coffee drinker or heck, even a business owner that serves coffee, he's going to give us some resources that will be super helpful for you. And then if you're interested in any of the equipment, look at the show notes because we'll put some links into, he talks about grinders and different types of coffee brands that he's mentioned. So we'll put some links in there. So if you are looking to getting into coffee, or if you are a coffee drinker and would like to know more about other brands that are out there, those will be in the show notes as well.
And you can find the show notes at hungrysquared.com.
Enjoy the episode.
We are here with Chris Deferio. He is an 18-year veteran of the specialty coffee industry. Over the years, working in the trenches of some of the nation's best shops, Chris has taken on many roles, from award-winning barista work, bar training and competition, to management, business development, and consultation. His focus and passion is helping cafes develop the foundational elements for success in caring for their staff, customer, and coffee quality. Chris now runs Keys to the Shop, which is a leading industry podcast and consultation business based in Louisville, Kentucky, where he lives with his wife, son, and probably too many coffee mugs.
Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. It's great to be on your show.
We are very excited because I'll just tell you this right now. We kind of interacted via Instagram. Actually, I kind of interacted with your wife on Instagram, and we were just like going back and forth and found your podcast that way. So, and I had to confess, I don't drink coffee for religious reasons, but I know nothing about it, but I do like perusing the coffee aisle and smelling all the good smells.
Right.
Yeah. So I was really excited when we kind of like, hey, we should have you on, and it worked out. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's really an honor to be on your show. I feel like I must be the coolest husband in the world because my wife's a huge, huge fan of your podcast. And so I'm just going to be so cool now.
Hey, Lindsay. Okay, well, let's get started. Like I said, I know very little about coffee, and Sharon knows a little bit. I think she knows more.
Yes, I do drink coffee, but I haven't been drinking it for a long time. I've just barely gotten the hang of, I can do my French press really great. And I've just gotten the hang of doing my chintzy little drip coffee maker with the timer on it so I can have it on my way to work. And I know what I like and that kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know all the nuances, if you will.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have Chris on, is because he helps consult cafes and businesses and such so that they can provide something great. But then he also does community classes and tells regular folks like us on how to brew a good cup of coffee. So Chris, can we start really quickly? Can you tell us a brief history of coffee and how it was discovered? I know there's probably not a pinpoint spot when coffee was discovered, but can you tell us a little bit of the origins of how coffee came about?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the legend is one of a goat herder named Kaldi that discovered coffee in Ethiopia/Yemen. And we're not 100% positive. People go on one side or the other with that. Round about the 15th century or so, people kind of saw that the kind of monasteries in Ethiopia and Yemen were drinking coffee. And so that story kind of originated from those centers, intellectual centers. And as time passed and travelers from Europe came in through Arabia, they just saw this drink, fame of the drink spread, went back home. And then there's this complicated history of smuggling coffee plants into Europe. There's slavery, trade routes. There's a whole dicey history behind how coffee spread across the world. Basically, it amounts to coffee being adopted by observing the Arabian people drinking it and enjoying it. And then we started coffee shops in Europe, and that spread to the Americas where coffee was planted. And now the only natural coffee you find in the world, where it's originated, is in Ethiopia and Yemen. Everywhere else that grows coffee grows it because it was planted there. And a lot of it from the Dutch East India Trading Company, taking coffee, planting it in Indonesia, and through the spice trade routes, popularizing it throughout the world. So it kind of matriculated through the population of the world via trade routes and some, like I said, some dicey history. There's a bunch of books. There's one book called Uncommon Grounds by Mark Pendergrast. That's a really good book that I always loved about the history of coffee, along with the history of the brand of coffee in America, et cetera. But that's kind of how we got to where we are. It wasn't really drank the way we do now. Used to.
Oh, yeah. Go into that. I'm curious now. I'm like, really?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time in which the way it was consumed was just by eating it. Travelers would take green coffee and wrap it in animal fat and take it on the road, like a early version of a Larabar or a Cliff Bar or something, for energy. And the other ways were just boiling the seeds themselves, but not necessarily roasting them. I'm actually not sure where roasting started, probably also in Ethiopia and Yemen. But it was probably not that great tasting as it is today. We've come a long way in terms of the quality of the drink that we're enjoying now.
I'm a little surprised. Sharon and I both peeked up when you said pretty much everything, the original plant came from Ethiopia, Yemen region, and everything else is
planted.
It's that those were the original plants. That's surprising. So I'm not so. The great grandfathers and grandmothers of our coffee plants are from there.
Absolutely, yes.
And they've probably been, I don't know, how do you say it? Maybe it's probably not genetically modified, but grown and cultivated to have the different flavors now, I'm assuming.
In part, yes. I think what happens with coffee when it's planted, you just see what you get, really, at first. And then that depends on the terroir, or the elements that the place where the coffee is planted offers to that coffee. So you could plant a coffee tree that you took over from Ethiopia and have it grow in South America, for instance. But because the soil is different, and because the rainfall, sunlight, everything that plants need is different, it's going to produce a different flavor. And from there, once you discover what you have, you can, just like apples, for instance, you can sort of modify the way that it produces a result. So much of the world's coffee is based on kind of that logic, where what do we have here? What does the land kind of set as the trajectory for this coffee and its potential flavor? And now how can we manipulate that? Back in the day, people didn't have labs necessarily. They're just cutting pieces of branches off, and much of like we do today with grafting and natural processes. So I wouldn't say it's genetically modified in that sense, because I think that brings up a lot of kind of Frankenstein science thoughts.
Right. But you do bring up a really good point that, yeah, like with any type of crop or Heck, when you say chocolate or cheese, even like what the animals are eating or what's in the soil really comes out in the final product. So totally makes sense.
So how do the different flavors get into the coffee? Like when you get some of those chocolate notes or things like that, is that from the soil or is that like an after product when they're roasting the beans, they're adding some other things?
Yeah, it's a good question because oftentimes you'll see, and I've done this and everyone's done it, where you look at the wall of coffee and there's all these
Right. It tastes like this. It's like wine or something. Like, can you really taste the oak?
So it's confusing because each marketing company, or I'd say each coffee company, wants to differentiate the flavor of their coffee. So we end up having to sort through it all. And really where these flavors come from, they're nuances that are revealed through the brewing process, which you really have to take one of those, in the movies where they say 10 years earlier, go back in time and see what is it that was planted, like we were just talking about, and then go from there. So where the flavor comes from is largely dependent on what you plant. There's lots of different types of coffee plants in the world, hundreds. There's really just two types of coffee plants that produce coffee that we can drink. The Robusta, which is like a low-grade coffee that is robust, as the name suggests, but it doesn't really produce a great cup of coffee. It's a lot more caffeine in there. It's kind of more bitter tasting because of that. And then there's Arabica, which is the more highly marketed one you see on cans and bags all over the place. Mm-hmm. That is higher elevation grown coffee, and it has more delicate nature to it. So those coffees produce more nuanced notes. Partially, it's based on what you plant, and you can't really take a bad seed, a coffee seed, because it's technically not a bean, it's a seed from a cherry. You can't take a bad one and then roast it to taste really amazing. So you have to start with a good raw product. So let's say we start with that Arabica plant grown in Peru, for instance. Depending on how much sunlight the plant gets versus cloud cover, canopy, rainfall, etc., the fruit will develop a X number of nuances within it based on sugar, based on just the carbohydrates, etc., that are in that food. It's a cherry. So when it's processed, then it's taken off of the tree. It's harvested either by hand or mechanically. And a lot of specialty coffee, I'd say most, is harvested by hand. And there are some decent mechanical processes that have been developed that aren't decimating coffee trees. But you can pick that ripe coffee. You have to pick it ripe. That's another thing, which sounds like, of course, you have to pick it right. But a lot of people, especially when it's not specialty coffee, don't do that.
And then do they just let it continue ripening, or does it stop ripening if they pick it prematurely? A little bit of an interjection.
Well, if you don't pick it, it will fall to the ground and just sit there and decompose. If you pick it too early, it's going to be, you can imagine, green tasting, raw. And there are sorting processes in mills that sort through ripe cherries versus non-ripe cherries, which means ripe seeds versus non-ripe seeds. So the potential of the seed is dependent on the timing with which you apply your harvest. So now that you've got this cherry, you process it either one of two ways. You're going to have the washed process or a natural process. And the short version of this is that washed basically puts the cherry through a water mill that squeezes the seed out from that cherry, and then it usually produces a cleaner, brighter flavor, I would say. Natural process dries the cherry out, sometimes, a lot of times on raised beds, and those cherries turn into essentially raisins, and you can hear the seed clacking around inside of it. And what that does is it helps the seed absorb the sugars from the fruit, and it produces a fruity flavor because of the cherry, the flesh of the cherry, offering that sugar and its essence to the seed. And so you've got two types of processing that have many different subcategories. There's hybrid versions of both of them that are almost too many to name, but that influences the flavor again, how well you do those. After that, you get it into the country where it's going to be roasted, you roast it, and here's where we tend to have a large degree of variation because of marketing. We'll go dark, we'll go light.
What does that mean with the dark and the light roasting?
Right.
I know, like, you know, when you get the packages that say like this is a blonde roast that has more caffeine than the dark roast, then there's like a French roast. And what are the different types of roasts?
Yeah, it's a good question.
And I'm going to actually put in a kind of a side question is like, maybe you can just back up and can you describe the roasting process? Because once those are either washed or natural processed, what does the actual roasting process entail? I'm assuming it's just applying heat, or maybe you can go into that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first question, though, was about the dark and light, and then I can just kind of wrap them into one answer. So the roasting process basically turns the raw seed into what we know as roasted coffee. Coffee is green when you see it. It's kind of a light green color. Maybe it's bluish green, depending on the origin. But you can't drink that, and you probably wouldn't want to. So the roasting process is where we simplify it by saying light and dark. So it's not technically light and dark. It's based on how the coffee develops in the roaster. So roasting basically applies heat, convection or conductive heat, depending on the roaster. So there's air roasters that just use a fluid bed of hot air for convection heat, and then the conductive heat of drum roasting is it's the more favored, I'd say, at least at this time. But I know people who roast on both that produce great coffee. So the whole point, though, is to transform the potential flavors and that potential energy contained in that seed into something that will offer itself to hot water or water. So you apply the heat, you go through different stages of developing sugars. There's the Maillard reaction, of course, and lots of different chemical reactions that happen within the coffee during the roasting process. And there are some telltale signs that your coffee is going through this process when you're roasting. And you may or may not have heard of these. There's a first crack where the coffee takes on so much heat and the cellular structure starts to break down and it pops just like popcorn would. And it expands. Coffee expands in the roasting process as it takes on these changes. And then there's a second crack where we tend not to go in roasting, but where a lot of more commercially available coffees go. And that's a darker, more carboned coffee, I would say. There are some good coffees in that as well. But the second crack is as if, do you imagine not taking your popcorn out of the popcorn popper and making it pop a second time? Might take on some quote unquote roasty flavors, maybe some off flavors.
Or burnt.
So
that's where you get the burnt smell in some of the coffees, maybe?
I would say so. But like I said, there's good techniques in doing both of these. There's ways of roasting coffee that where you can apply heat well, just like cooking. You could turn it up all the way on high, put green beans in your pan and walk away. You won't be happy, but they certainly did cook. Or you can finesse it. You can move them around in the pan and evenly heat them. And that's what we're doing with coffee. So a drum roaster, for instance, you're talking about there's an auger on the inside of the drum roaster that moves the coffee beans around so that they take on the heat evenly and they develop. And there's a roaster outside the roasting machine controlling the flow of gas, the height of the flame, the amount of airflow through the roaster. All of this sort of helps charge and push forward or pull back the development of the coffee. So if you look up roasting curves on Google, that will give you some images of people's readouts where you can see where coffee develops over the course of on a line graph. And these points at which it rides at a particular temperature, it's developing different nuances at that point than it is in the beginning. So it's a real interesting transformation that coffee undergoes that can be completely ruined. Coffee can be ruined in the roaster, or the potential can be released, developed, and brought out of the coffee. And it all depends on your skill, the quality of your equipment, and like we said in the beginning, the quality of your raw product. So that's a long answer to the question of where these flavors come from, and got a little bit on the roasting train there, but light roasted coffees are coffees that are generally roasted before second crack. They are dropped out of the roaster into a cooling tray, before they can reach that point where they reach second crack. Darker roasted coffees are ones that generally are closer to or at and beyond second crack in the roasting process. And the oils and nuances of the coffee start to be seen on the outside of the bean. So this could be a good thing to talk about, which is...
That makes so much sense. I just have to insert that.
Yeah. So if you look at coffee in the supermarket or on the shelf of a coffee shop, if the coffee is oily, those are the nuances that the coffee has to offer, and that is a coffee that's generally been roasted a bit darker. The nuances in the aromatics of coffee are in those oils. Those are inside the lighter roasted coffees, and they're protected from the environment. So an oily coffee is being oxidized, and so it can easily turn rancid if left for too long.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, because you've seen, I'm just in the grocery store at some of these coffee shops or tea shops, and you're right. Like, I never thought of that before, but you can see that. But as you said, any oil can go rancid over time, especially if it's just been sitting there and you don't know how long it's been sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
Which is typically why my palate finds that I do not like dark roast coffee.
It's hard to sort of go back in time and know what the history of this coffee was to know why we don't like things. Like, partially, yes, this dark roasted coffee might have been just completely over roasted. It could have been baked in the roaster. The coffee itself might just be less than great in quality. And so I kind of reside in work in the specialty coffee industry, where there's very low, 0 to 5, I think. I forget the parts, actually. The specialty coffee standard is a very stringent standard of defects allowable in green samples. And specialty was a term originally that came up with a coffee trader named Irma Knudsen, writing in Coffee and Tea Trade Journal to refer to special microclimates that exist within coffee farms that produce these more unique flavor compounds. And so you have a more commercial industry of coffee, and then you've got specialty coffee, where things are standards for quality, both at the farm level and in the cup, are a lot more stringent.
Gotcha. Can I ask a really quick question? Going back to the whole roasting process, you kind of mentioned it depended on this. I mean, obviously it depends on the original product or the original seed that comes out and how that was either harvested and processed. But then you also mentioned the skill of the roaster. Now, I'm curious, you've consulted a lot. You've consulted a lot of cafes and restaurants and businesses. I'm curious, I'm sure there's quite a learning curve for that roasting process, so that they don't do it, or, they pull it off at the right time. They don't burn it, or they don't make it go past second crack, or if that's what they're going for. Tell me about, I'm curious to know about the skill level and the teaching process, or even the trade on-site apprenticeship of learning how to roast coffee.
Oh, yeah. Interesting question. It is a lot of trial and error, but not error that, at least in specialty, we're not passing on the error to the customer. In fact, there's very little room for error when it comes to roasting in specialty. You, as a new roaster, will probably go this route. You'll probably work at a roastery bagging coffee, for instance, getting used to the environment. It's a chaotic, hot or cold, depending. It's just a raw environment. It's a lot of work. So you got to get used to that first. Eventually, you're going to learn more about flavor. You're going to cup coffees and taste coffees. You have to know how to taste coffee in order to roast coffee, because how could you test your work? A chef needs to know how to taste their food in order to cook it consistently. And no less is true of coffee. So after a while of proving yourself in that environment and learning how to taste coffee, the mechanical part comes in, where you might shadow a roaster, the master roaster, the head roaster, whatever the company decides to call the person responsible for all of their production roasting. Another thing might happen with that, in that you might be supervised to do what we call sample roasting, which is a really small roaster that is used in the roastery to roast samples of coffees that the company gets from importers. So an importing company like Cafe Imports, for example, in Minneapolis, they will bring in lots of green samples. They've got offering sheets. You bring in those samples in little baggies and you roast them up to see if you want to bring in or buy these 150 pound bags of it versus these little baggies. You learn a little bit about sample roasting. You're going to learn the beginnings of what it means to be a production roaster. Now, I personally am not a roaster. This is knowledge that I'm just from working in roasteries and in speaking with and being in community with many great roasters. This is the track that I see happening. After a while of learning from the roaster in the production, they'll kind of supervise you doing some of these things, controlling the gas, controlling the airflow. And when they're satisfied, and that might be soon for some and later for others, you will get to roast a batch on your own, which is usually a very fearful endeavor.
I think I would be super stressed out. I'm going to be honest. I'm like, oh man, I'm going to ruin this.
Yeah. I've seen people sweat bullets because that roaster does not stop. We're talking about a huge flame. Like the roaster fires are not too uncommon. We're working with fire here and powerful machinery. So, and you're trying to pull out delicate flavors from these big batches of raw green coffee. This big heated drum is just tossing them around, and you're supposed to finesse this by turning a crank, by pulling a lever, looking at the readout on the computer as the instrument tells you what temperature internally the beans are going to. There's a lot of multitasking, I would say, or task switching, whichever camp you're in, between the roaster and the computer. It's a complicated process, but it takes time. You're not going to learn to be a master roaster or roast production roasting, I would say maybe a year if it's an intense program, but it still takes a lot to learn to really do it consistently and well.
That's super intense, especially like when you said roasting fires are not uncommon. That made me pause.
Yes. It's like, yeah.
No, yeah. If you clean your equipment, if you clean your roaster, you probably will avoid fires. But as they say it in roasting circles, it's not if you're going to have a fire, it's when.
Oh, dear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's not like every week.
Yeah, no, but it's not uncommon. So thank you. That was very interesting. I'd love to see how people get trained up on things like that. So thank you for answering that question. I am wondering, so once the beans are roasted, and I guess what is kind of the shelf life once, we can start talking about grind in just a minute, like if they're ground or if they're whole, but like if the beans are roasted and just packaged that way so people can take it home, what is the shelf life for a roasted coffee bean?
That's a tricky one because coffee doesn't necessarily go bad in the way that we think. And we're going to open up and see mold in it. There may be rare occasions, but that may be just contamination. But it doesn't go bad that way. It just gets worse. That's what it does. So it becomes a shell. So the point of roasting is to bring out these delicate nuances, to put them into liquid form. This is coffee. This is the whole point. And like I said, they're delicate and they don't really last as long as we would like them to. I would say that once you get a roasted coffee, you're talking about a window of about a month or so of optimum flavor, depending on the origin and the degree of roast. So, we mentioned earlier that the visible oils on the surface of coffee tend to degrade faster, maybe go rancid. Those are the types of coffees, if you let it go for a month on your shelf, you're not going to be as happy with the result, by and large. These are sweeping generalities, by the way, of course, as you would with a coffee that's lighter roasted. Say, coffee like from Ethiopia, Yirgacheffe, for instance, they typically are roasted lighter to bring out the more kind of citrusy elements of the coffee. And those could be very good. A month. I've had Ethiopian coffees, Kenyan coffees, and even some Colombian and maybe some other coffees I can't remember offhand, roasted to a lighter degree that I've tasted at a month, and they've been fine. And as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that I might just be considering a month so long to me because I work in coffee. But I know people keep coffee on their shelves for a very long time, maybe even forget about it, and then brew it and then wonder why it doesn't taste good.
Yep.
Those nuances have went off to better pastures. You know, they're the departed from the coffee, and what you're left with is the roasted husk and fiber and hot water.
Yeah, it totally makes sense from a chemical standpoint. Like those aromatic compounds, I think probably there's going to be some ethers and stuff like that. Those dissipate. Those can dissipate quite quickly. And so it makes sense to, when you say a month, and I was like, that kind of makes sense actually, to lose some of those really delicate flavors that you may not notice 6 months down the line, for example.
And the funny thing is green coffee does the same thing. If you keep coffee for too long in storage, green coffee too long in storage, it also loses its nuances. A coffee that we bring in the roastery that's a fresh crop will have so much complexity and dynamic flavors in the cup. A year later, if you've kept it for a year, which generally you probably shouldn't if you're a roaster, it's not going to offer the same thing, even though it's not roasted yet. Each time you take the coffee a step further, the window of opportunity for that coffee to be a delicious drink gets smaller and smaller. But I would also balance this with saying, it's not that you should just only drink coffee like somebody might think, I'm going to just drink coffee that's been roasted that day. That way, I'll have the best coffee in the world. And it is absolutely not the case. In fact, you probably might have the worst coffee in the world if you try that.
That's interesting.
There's a resting process that coffee needs to go through in order to let those flavors develop in kind of, I don't know what happens chemically exactly, but there's a degassing period that we know about where CO2 has to leave the coffee. It's still just built up inside the bean. And if you grind coffee and put hot water on it, and it's a really fresh coffee just roasted, you'll notice a huge mountain of air start to escape from it, almost like it's fizzy.
Really?
And that's basically what it is. It's CO2 leaving the bean. And that's okay, but there's a lot of it when it's fresh that needs to be given an opportunity to dissipate in order for water to actually do its job and extract the flavor the coffee actually has to offer instead of just getting rid of gas in the process. So I generally tell people a week or maybe 4 days to a week is a great time to start brewing your coffee. That might be dependent on the origin again. But in the first day or so, I definitely think, personal opinion, but from a lot of experience, probably not going to get the greatest out of that coffee.
That is really interesting. That reminds me of like things that need to rest. Like you don't cut into a steak right away. Right. After you pull it off, it needs to rest. There's just a lot. You're right. I mean, there's something that happens in that time of when things are equilibrating. And that's really interesting. So 4 days to a week is when you're probably going to start getting the optimal time brew. So, okay, well, cool. That was very interesting.
So what happens when you've got these whole beans that you buy at your specialty roaster versus maybe you don't have a coffee grinder at home and so you buy some ground coffee? What would be a time frame for freshness in that?
Well, each process, again, the window of opportunity is lower or smaller each time the coffee undergoes a change like this. And so grinding is the step after roasting the coffee. You're exposing surface area to the environment each time you do that. You grind the bean. And so the window for ground coffee it's hard to say, again, with origins, but if you're looking for an equivalent comparison, what is maybe a week or 2 weeks to a whole bean coffee that you're grinding and brewing right away is maybe a day or so to a coffee that has been ground and is left out.
Wow.
In terms of what you're going to get from the cup. There's packaging, the miracle of nitrogen flushed packages, for instance. Illy Cafe does this, where they nitrogen flush their coffees, and that they do that so that they can preserve the flavors longer in pre-ground form and whole bean. But there's no amount of fancy packaging that is going to make coffee perpetually ageless. And grinding your coffee just really cuts short the window of opportunity to capture those flavors in the cup. And so if you're seeing a coffee that's ground on the shelf, you're probably going to just be getting some really basic flavors from that coffee. You're not going to get the kind of nuances that you would normally get from a coffee that's had those aromatic compounds protected in the whole bean form. You know, a little lock and safe in that bean that you're unlocking when you grind the coffee. So I don't like to advocate for pre-ground coffee, but I will say if I want to have some quiet time in the morning, I will pre-grind my coffee at night. So I don't
Smart.
wake up my son in the morning, and it's been fine. But when I have the opportunity, grinding fresh is the thing.
And I'm assuming you just have they have coffee grounders, right? Just little machines and such that you can buy for a couple of cups of coffee.
Yeah, you want to stay away from blade grinders or / spice grinders where you have to kind of shake things around in there. They're fun for, flax seeds and other things that you do for cooking that aren't nearly as dependent on uniform grind particle size as coffee is. We need to have a burr grinder for coffee to really, and they're not super expensive. You can get probably Black & Decker probably makes some. My favorite brand is Baratza out of Portland, Oregon. I have one on my counter called a Preciso. There's the Baratza Encore grinder. That's a good price point, maybe about $100. I say it's a good price point. It's actually a great one for grinders for what you get. If you're saving money on a coffee grinder, you're probably losing flavor in the coffee at a certain point. So stick with burr grinders is my usual go-to because the burrs, these plates with precisely cut not blades, but cutting teeth, will slice the coffee and cut the coffee into more uniform shapes where you can extract flavor more evenly in the process of brewing. So if you cut a carrot, for instance, in many different tiny, dice it, and then you cut big chunks and you put it in the pan, they're going to cook at different rates. The smaller it is, the faster it cooks. So you're going to get undercooked and overcooked in the same one. Same exact thing with coffee.
I love that analogy. That's really, you're totally right. So uniformity is huge when it comes to the grind of your coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So,
it is, absolutely.
So stay away from spice grinders, everybody, is what I've taken away from this. And go with the burr grinder. And we'll put some links in the show notes for that as for the home consumer. So now let's talk about grinding. You can do quite a fine grind, and you can also do kind of a little bit coarser grind. How does that correlate for taste, as you've noticed, and then also maybe caffeine content, that type of thing? Because you are, I'm assuming, with a finer grind, you're getting more surface area, more caffeine. Can you kind of expound on that a little?
Yes, you probably will get more caffeine from that. Yeah, when you grind coarser, you are exposing less surface area, so you extract less from it, and that would include caffeine for sure. How noticeable that is in the cup, I think, is kind of a mystical process of, I swear, when I grind it coarser, I get more or less. Just like light and dark roast, for instance, caffeine content is one of those things that it depends on your physiology, but the coffee ground finer will over extract. It will bring out a lot of caffeine, which is bitter, but it will also bring out a lot more unpleasant characteristics from the coffee, mainly because once the coffee is done giving up the ghost, so to speak, it will still offer you stuff. It'll still offer you bits and pieces of its hull. And even though you don't want any more, the water is still extracting, the coffee is still giving, but it should have stopped a while ago. And because it's ground so fine, that's what's happening. It's giving too much of itself to the process. Coarse ground coffee is just withholding too much from the water. And you will find a taste that's a little bit more grassy and light and It can be bitter as well, mostly astringent, and pithy is another one that you would get from coffee that's ground too coarse. Watery, of course, would be another one. Yeah, grinding the right size is all about having the right number of fines and larger sized coffee particles to let the water through at a particular rate. So the way you know that you have a good grind size is if, for instance, you're grinding for a 12-ounce cup of coffee, let's say. If your brew takes about 3 to 4 minutes to complete for that size, you've got a good grind size. So time is a factor here that tells you how appropriate the size of your grind is for the brewing process. So French press, for instance, French press is an immersion process that will take a longer time because it's a coarser grind. So if you keep the coffee in contact with the water for a longer period of time, if it's a coarse grind, it will work into the coffee enough to pull out those flavors. And that's what French press needs, is a coarse grind. If you go down to like a Mr. Coffee machine, which maybe we can talk more on that, but I generally don't advocate that for reasons of water temperature. But if you've got a good brewer at home that reaches like 200, use that 3 to 4 minutes of brew time for a maybe 10 to 12 ounce cup of coffee. That's great. That's generally where you want to be. All the way to espresso, which is really fine, and it takes all of 25 seconds to do, 25 to 30 seconds, because it's fine. So time is correlated directly with grind size. Bigger grind size, longer time. Smaller grind size, shorter time.
Can we talk a little bit about methods for preparing coffee and how that affects like the taste? So we talked about French press a little bit and the immersion process with that. Can we talk about like drip versus pour over and things like that?
Mm-hmm. So drip versus pour over. I do pour over at home. I love it. I tend to be wary of it on bar because there's so many people doing the same thing that there's bound to be variation. But for home, it's great, I think, because it's just you and you have your method. Pour over is just a manual version of what an automatic coffee machine does. So there's a romance to it that is quite nice. I don't know that you're going to get inherently any different flavors from the coffee simply because it's you brewing it versus a machine, unless your machine is really bad. and if you've got a great machine and you've got a great pour over setup, like a Kalita Wave pour over setup, for instance, then you might just get the same coffee from both. In fact, the brewer, if it's a good brewer, will probably give you a more consistent result because it's designed to do one thing, unlike us who are designed to do like a million things. So we just make coffee and maybe we're really tired one morning and we pour the water too fast. Okay, well now we've just pushed all of the coffee fine particles down to the bottom of the brew bed, and it's acting as a secondary filter and it's choking the flow of water, which means now what's supposed to be a 3 to 4 minute brew on your Kalita pour over is turning into a 6-minute brew. And gosh, we don't have the time right now to do another brew. I've got to get to work, so I'm going to drink that 6-minute brew. Now your life's horrible. So,
oh man!
all right. And the machine is not going to, most of the time, is not going to all of a sudden put out a ton of water for no reason. It wasn't up late last night partying or anything. So I would say if you like the romance of it, if you want to just experience that with pour over, and you can be exact and experiment with different methods of making coffee, pour over is for you. And if you just want a repeatable cup of coffee and don't care too much about experimenting with different flow rates and all that jazz, then a great brewer is probably in order.
That makes a lot of sense. So can we do so we've already talked a little bit about the coarseness of the grind, or the fineness of the grind rather, and then how long it's allowed to brew. So the time, like you said, is related to the coarseness. You've briefly mentioned the temperature, and you mentioned something about getting it up to 200. I'm wondering what is the ideal temperature? Is there an ideal temperature for the water? And then maybe we can get a little bit into water itself. I don't know if hard water or soft water. I'm not. Is that a thing? I just don't know. So maybe temperature and the water quality. How do those affect your cup?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think maybe we could start with let's start with temperature and just say get your water to at least 198. And now that's really low, in my opinion. 201 degrees and above, even all the way up to 208 or 210, is, I think, appropriate for coffee. Because what happens is it hits that bed of grounds, and that ground coffee is room temperature. And so what you end up with is water that's now no longer at 210. Maybe it's dropped a few degrees. So you're not literally, the coffee is not sitting with that particular temperature of water, at least in the beginning. You want to create an environment in the beginning process of extraction that's hot enough to pull out flavors. If it's too cold and you're just pouring this kind of cool or tepid warm water on top, it's just not active enough. The water molecules are not active enough to pull out from the coffee what needs to be pulled out. The other side of it is that if your water is completely boiling, like way too hot, you're going to pull out too much and you're going to evaporate those nuances and completely decimate the nuances of your coffee. So I'd say 201 degrees, between 201 and 210 is where I like to brew coffee. Here's a trick, I think, that works most of the time. And that is, if you know that it's a natural processed coffee that you've got, generally you can get away with a lower temperature, like between 201 and 207 or so. Something like a washed processed coffee, where the bean is more dense in nature, will need hotter water to sort of help it give up those flavors. So that's a little trick that I picked up, and it works most of the time for me. Now, the water quality itself is a big, big, big one. You can go all the way from distilled water to high mineral content water, where you have on one end no minerals in the water, and consequently the water has nothing with which to grip the flavors in the coffee and pull them out. So that's what minerals, the appropriate amount of minerals, should do for your coffee. Is it gives the compounds in the coffee something to grab onto, and it gives the water something to grab with, and then it pulls those into your cup of coffee. If you've got distilled water, it's not going to do anything.
There. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So it might be fun for irons, not for coffee. And so then you've got coffee that has a high mineral content, where there's so much calcium, so much magnesium, where there's no room for the compounds. The water's already full. There's nothing left there's no room for the flavors to go. And so the equal problem is not no flavors, but fewer flavors make it into the cup. So between hard and soft water, I can give you sort of a general guideline for the grains of hardness that you should have in your water at home to make great coffee, because you can pick up a TDS, total dissolved solids meter, at like Walmart for $8. Oh. Test your water to see what the content is.
Yeah.
And it's not a big investment to actually miraculously change the flavor of your coffee. Coffee is important. So the TDS of coffee, generally ideal, would be like 150 milligrams per liter. And then you're talking about a pH of 7. So those are good things to keep in mind. Grains of hardness, 4 grains of hardness per liter is another metric that you can use for your coffee. And this is the right combination of things like magnesium and other minerals that help coffee. Now, you don't want water that has chlorine and other kind of funky flavors. So I advocate purifying your water. But if you're using something like RO water in your house, unless you're remineralizing your water, you're still basically using distilled water.
Distilled water, yeah. I was like, you're not going to get that. Okay. So so I'm curious now. So in order to kind of solve the problems that you may have with water in your house, depending on if you have, like you said, reverse osmosis, water situation or extremely hard water, which is what I have here at my house. And I go pick up one of those meters and notice that I have extremely high water mineral content in my water. So do I dilute that down with some distilled water? Is that how you would? Is that a way to solve that?
Yeah, I mean, purify it, obviously, but then cut it with some distilled and see what you end up with. Make a cocktail of coffee water. Now, obviously, we're not going to have the wherewithal every day to be like, well, I'm out of coffee water. I have to make a new batch. But there's a lot of us that do that. There's a company called Third Wave Water, actually, that was on Shark Tank, and they sell these mineral packets that you put into distilled water to give you a kind of a recipe for good coffee water.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And if you've got the ability, I know you can make your own mineral mix. I'm not sure which companies sell just straight magnesium, et cetera. But the easiest thing to do, I think, is right on the money. Dilute it a little bit, and hopefully you're not in that extreme category where it's so hard or just there's nothing in it. But if you are, that's a good option.
Okay, that's got a problem solved, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Chris, I know that we've had you on for a long time and we've talked a lot about a variety of topics. Can we ask just a couple of few last questions and then we'll get you on your way? We'll just kind of do a little bit of lightning round. Okay, what are you drinking in your cup of coffee right now? What's in your mug right now?
Well, it used to be in my mug and I drank it all, actually.
Oh.
But it is from Klatch Coffee Roasters in California, and good friends of mine, they gave me some coffee at a trade show. So they're Onyx Blend. Not sure what's in it. I don't have the bag in front of me, but it's I'd say it's a more approachable blend. So there's good roasty flavors. I'd say roasty, but like darker cocoa, nuts, and some nice citrus. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Nice. Okay, next thing. If we're going to the supermarket, what's the best course to buy? What's the best one to buy? Like, I know that's really broad and it depends on your supermarket, but should I go whole bean? Should I go what would you recommend?
Go whole bean for sure. Make sure you have a conical burr grinder. Get whole bean coffee. Make sure that when you purchase it on the shelf that it is in a one-way valve bag that lets CO2 out and keeps oxygen out of the bag. Lets CO2 out of the bag. And look at the roast date. If the coffee doesn't have a roast date, I would just not buy it, because you don't know when that thing was first roasted, and so look for a roast date that's within at least a few weeks of roast on the bag.
And how should we be storing the coffee?
Great question, because a lot of people will put it in the refrigerator, which is absolutely not where you should be putting coffee.
Oh.
Because it will take on flavors the same way like baking soda will if you put it in your fridge. The whole point. So coffee is the enemy of coffee storage is moisture, ironically enough. So you should store coffee ideally in a cool, airtight canister in a dark place. You're just in a cupboard in a somewhat temperature-controlled environment, and grind it when you need it. Now, if you want to keep coffee for a long time in the freezer, you can do that. You shouldn't have it in a permeable bag. Again, you should have it in an airtight container of some kind. And you should really only take out as much as you need to use at a time. So if you take out the whole can from the freezer, put it on your counter, go take a shower and come back, it's already started to develop moisture on the outside of the bean. And then you're just going to freezer burn that coffee.
Yeah, and that's probably gross.
Right. So just as much as you need, and you can freeze the coffee. I would recommend you actually let that coffee that you're going to use from the freezer come up to room temperature a little bit, and then grind and use it. But yeah, the ideal thing is cool, airtight, dark, dry environment in your home.
That is perfect. Okay, well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. That was very insightful. I learned a ton.
Yeah, this was so much fun.
Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know anything about coffee, and I learned a ton today. So thank you. You guys, you can find Chris at his podcast. And so you can find him on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere. Go find him. It's Keys to the Shop. And once again, it's about coffee, the coffee industry, and his consulting business there. So, and if you happen to be a cafe owner or a business owner that would love to be in touch with him, go ahead and you can find him at keystotheshop.com. A couple of episodes that are really awesome that we'd recommend to start out with. Episode 37, chocolate and coffee. Sounds good, right? Episode 42, supplying and selecting equipment. So if that's something that you, once again, are interested in doing, that it would be a great starting point. And then episode 43, he does talk to some different business people. Founder Friday with Kathy Toriano. So those are 3 episodes that would be good to jump into if you are interested in learning more about coffee and hanging out with Chris on his podcast. So once again, Chris, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Well, I really appreciate you guys having me on, and it was really fun. Thanks.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks for joining us today for our show. You can find us at hungrysquared.com, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Play Music.
Hey, you guys, you probably have noticed that we haven't had a food fight for a little while. So you should send us an email at hungrysquared@gmail.com.
Yes.
And it largely has to do with the fact that we've had a lot of really awesome interviews, so we didn't want to cut them short. But we'll just keep adding to our list of questions if you want to send one our way. So send us an email at hungrysquared@gmail.com, and we will answer it probably on the next episode. And join us next week for our next episode of Food Nerdery.
Okay, love you. Bye.
Bye.
Hungry Squared, yeah, Hungry Squared.